At 25,000 feet, the enemy was not the first thing killing crews. The gunner noticed it as confusion. His hands felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The metal beneath his gloves burned with cold, yet he couldn't feel his fingers properly. He tried to adjust his oxygen mask and fumbled the strap twice before realizing he'd forgotten what he was trying to do. The bomber's engines droned steadily, the sky outside bright and empty. But inside the aircraft, something was slipping. Across the fuselage, another crewman sat motionless at his station. No wound, no impact, just stillness. When someone shook him, his head rolled forward and his mask hung loose, rimmed with frost. The oxygen line feeding it had frozen solid. At this altitude, unconsciousness did not arrive dramatically. It crept in quietly, disguised as fatigue, as distraction, as a simple mistake that lasted too long. The sky itself was erasing them. High-altitude bombing promised safety. Fly above the reach of most anti-aircraft guns. Climb beyond the comfort zone of enemy fighters. The bomber would become untouchable, protected by height and distance. Engineers built aircraft capable of reaching those altitudes faster than any previous generation. The machines performed exactly as intended. The human body did not. At temperatures colder than any winter on the ground, and air too thin to sustain clear thought, crews were fighting physics before they ever met the enemy. Frostbite crept through boots and sleeves. Oxygen systems iced and stuttered. Judgment slowed. Reaction times stretched. A bomber could cross an entire country while its crew hovered on the edge of blackout. Some never realized they were in danger until they woke up descending, or did not wake at all. The doctrine assumed altitude meant survival, but survival depended on more than escaping bullets. It depended on whether a human body could endure hours in an environment it was never meant to inhabit. The bomber had climbed higher than war had ever climbed before. The question was whether its crew could follow it, and what would happen if engineering reached the sky before medicine caught up. High-altitude bombing was born from a simple strategic idea. Distance equals protection. If bombers could climb high enough, they could operate above the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns, and beyond the comfortable ceiling of many intercepting fighters. Height would become armor. The sky itself would be the shield. Planners believed altitude could compensate for vulnerability, allowing heavy bombers to strike deep targets with fewer losses. The machines were built to match that vision. New bombers were designed with supercharged engines, reinforced wings, and oxygen plumbing threaded through the fuselage. They were not experimental prototypes. They were mass-produced aircraft meant to operate for hours in air too thin to breathe. On paper, the engineering worked. The aircraft could climb, cruise, and return. Performance charts proved the concept viable. But the charts measured engines, not people. Most early oxygen systems had evolved from equipment designed for shorter, lower-altitude flights. They worked well enough for brief exposure, but sustained operations at extreme height exposed their limits. Regulators froze. Moisture condensed inside hoses and turned to ice. Masks leaked around imperfect seals. Even when functioning correctly, the flow of oxygen demanded constant adjustment to match altitude changes. Crews became technicians of their own survival. They learned to monitor gauges as closely as enemy aircraft. A frozen line or slipping mask could quietly turn the cockpit into a hypoxic chamber. The danger was deceptive because its first symptom was confusion, the very condition that made diagnosis difficult. A crewman deprived of oxygen often believed he was thinking clearly, while his judgment deteriorated. Cold compounded the threat. Unpressurized bombers offered only partial heating, and exposed gun positions received almost none. At altitude, temperatures dropped far below freezing, cold enough to numb fingers through layered gloves. Frost accumulated on interior surfaces. Metal tools stuck to skin. Gunners struggled to operate weapons with hands that no longer responded with precision. The doctrine assumed crews would endure these conditions as part of the mission. Early planning treated altitude as a technical problem already solved by engines and airframes. The human cost was acknowledged, but underestimated. Training emphasized navigation, formation flying, and bombing accuracy. Survival in extreme environments remained an afterthought compared to reaching operational height. Yet every mission proved the same reality. The aircraft could live at altitude. The crew barely could. And as bombing campaigns intensified, the gap between machine capability and human tolerance began to show itself in reports that no commander could ignore. The warning signs accumulated in fragments. A navigator forgot the final leg of a route he had plotted himself. A gunner stared through his sights while enemy fighters passed unchallenged. Pilots reported moments of disorientation they could not explain. Seconds where instruments blurred and decisions lagged behind events. These incidents were easy to dismiss individually. Fatigue, stress, combat shock. But across squadrons, the pattern repeated too often to ignore. Flight surgeons began comparing notes. Medical officers attached to bomber groups collected crew testimonies after missions. They cataloged symptoms that sounded eerily similar. Dizziness, delayed reactions, memory gaps, a floating sensation followed by sudden clarity once altitude dropped. Some crews described waking from what felt like a brief nap, only to realize minutes had passed without awareness. Hypoxia was no longer theoretical. At extreme altitude, the body starved slowly, and the brain failed first. The danger was not dramatic collapse, but quiet erosion of judgment. A pilot deprived of oxygen might continue flying while losing the ability to recognize risk. A gunner could remain conscious yet incapable of responding to an attack. The bomber might appear operational, even as its crew slipped toward unconsciousness. Cold injuries added another layer. Gunners returned with fingers too numb to flex. Frostbite cases increased. Heated clothing existed, but early versions were unreliable and unevenly distributed. Some crews improvised by layering garments never intended for flight, trading mobility for insulation. Frozen gun mechanisms and stiffened control cables hinted that the aircraft itself was struggling in the same environment. The crisis forced investigation beyond the battlefield. Aviation medicine expanded from a niche specialty into a wartime priority. Researchers conducted altitude chamber experiments, exposing volunteers to controlled hypoxia to map how quickly cognition deteriorated. They studied oxygen flow rates, mask seals, and the physics of condensation inside equipment. Data replaced assumption. Survival at altitude became a measurable engineering problem. Engineers and physicians began working in tandem. Oxygen regulators were redesigned to deliver more consistent flow across altitude changes. Masks received improved seals to prevent leakage. Heating systems were refined, and electrically heated flight suits distributed more widely. Training programs taught crews to recognize the early signs of hypoxia in themselves and each other. Confusion, euphoria, clumsy movement, before impairment became irreversible. The goal was not comfort. It was function. Crews learned that survival depended on vigilance as much as equipment. They checked oxygen lines mid-flight, watched for frost buildup, and monitored one another for subtle behavioral shifts. A bomber crew became a collective life support system, each member responsible for detecting failure before it spread. Results appeared gradually. Reports of unexplained blackouts decreased. Frostbite cases stabilized. Missions still carried enormous risk, but the invisible threat of altitude receded from inevitability to hazard. Bombers continued flying at extreme heights, yet crews returned with clearer memory of their flights and greater confidence in their equipment. The machine had not descended to meet the limits of the body. Instead, the systems protecting the body had risen to meet the machine. And in that adjustment lay a turning point not only in bombing campaigns, but in how warfare understood the relationship between technology and the humans trapped inside it. Once survival systems caught up with altitude, bomber operations changed in ways that were subtle but decisive. Crews no longer treated oxygen equipment as fragile improvisation. It became as central to the mission as engines or navigation. With improved regulators and training, flights that once pushed men to the edge of blackout became sustainable. The difference showed not in dramatic headlines, but in consistency. Missions completed with fewer unexplained errors, formations held tighter. Gunners reacted faster. Pilots trusted their own judgment at altitude. Reliability restored confidence. Veteran crews accumulated instead of disappearing to injury and medical evacuation. Experience began to compound across squadrons. A bomber group that retained its specialists, navigators, engineers, gunners, gained an edge no replacement program could duplicate. Survival systems preserved knowledge, and knowledge translated into effectiveness. The environment did not become safe. Extreme altitude remained punishing. Heating still failed at times. Masks still iced in harsh conditions. But crews now understood the risks and possessed tools to manage them. Hypoxia shifted from invisible assassin to recognized threat. Awareness itself became protection. A man who knew the signs could descend, adjust flow, or alert his crew before impairment took hold. Strategically, the improvement mattered. High-altitude bombing depended on endurance. Aircraft that could remain at height for hours extended operational reach and reduced exposure to ground fire. By stabilizing human performance, survival engineering reinforced the doctrine that altitude provided protection. The bomber was no longer fighting its own environment as fiercely as it fought the enemy. In practical terms, survival systems became weapons, not against aircraft or guns, but against the physics that threatened to erase crews mid-mission. Each improvement preserved the continuity of operations. A squadron that stayed functional could refine tactics, coordinate more precisely, and return to the battlefield with accumulated skill. The sky remained hostile, but it no longer belonged entirely to the limits of the human body. And that shift allowed air campaigns to proceed with a level of stability that early missions could not have imagined. The altitude crisis did more than keep bomber crews alive. It rewrote the relationship between aviation and the human body. Before the war, aircraft performance advanced faster than medical understanding. Engineers built machines that reached environments biology had never prepared humans to inhabit. The bomber campaigns forced a correction. Survival was no longer assumed to follow engineering progress. It had to be engineered deliberately. From that pressure emerged modern aviation medicine. Research into hypoxia, cold exposure, and life support systems expanded into permanent disciplines. Pressure suits, improved oxygen delivery, and environmental control systems all traced their urgency back to crews fighting altitude in unpressurized bombers. Later generations of pilots, and eventually astronauts, inherited knowledge purchased at 25,000 feet by men learning in real time how thin air alters the mind. The lesson extended beyond aircraft. Technology would continue pushing humans into harsher environments, higher speeds, greater heights, deeper oceans, outer space. Each advance carried the same warning the bombers revealed. A machine that outruns the body must also protect it, or progress collapses under its own ambition. The bombers did not descend to safer skies. Instead, survival rose to meet them. And in that balance between engineering and physiology, modern flight found its foundation. Not in conquering altitude, but in learning how to carry humans safely through it.